A grand castle hall filled with nobility, a moment shatters the world of a grieving king. A peasant boy stands before the throne, holding what no commoner should possess, the royal sword of a prince who vanished 5 years ago. One object, instantly recognized by all, bringing silence crashing down like an executioner's axe. What would make a dying knight entrust a royal heirloom to a simple miller's son? What terrible truth lies buried in the forest, where secrets have been festering for 5 years? The sword's return threatens everything: power, succession, and the carefully crafted narrative of a kingdom in mourning. As assassin's arrows fly and betrayal emerges from the shadows, one question burns hotter than all others. Did the missing prince die at an enemy's hand? Or did he choose to disappear? The answer will shake a throne, change a kingdom, and force a father to confront the most devastating possibility of all. The torches flickered like dying hopes across the grand hall, casting long shadows that danced upon ancient tapestries. Laughter stopped abruptly. A wall of silence crashed through the castle's great hall, as if death himself had entered uninvited. But it wasn't death. It was worse. A peasant boy stood at the entrance, dirt-crusted fingernails clutching something wrapped in filthy cloth, his presence an insult to every gleaming chalice and every bejeweled finger in the room. The king's chest tightened, a familiar pain he had grown accustomed to over the years, the phantom ache of loss that never truly healed. He watched the intruder through narrowed eyes, feeling the weight of his crown pressing down upon his temples like a ring of thorns. The feast had been meant to dull his memories, not resurrect them. Yet something in the way the boy stood, shoulders squared despite his terror, stirred something forgotten in the monarch's hardened heart. Droplets of sweat formed on the young peasant's brow, trickling down like silent tears as he clutched his mysterious bundle. His worn leather boots left muddy imprints on the immaculate stone floor, each step a transgression against everything the nobility represented. The hall's perfumed air grew thick with tension, the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine now mingling with the unmistakable odor of the fields, earth, sweat, and honest labor. The contrast was as stark as the difference between the jewel-encrusted nobles and this threadbare youth who dared to stand among them. What manner of peasant disrupts the king's feast? Hissed a baron, his voice slicing through the silence like a poisoned dagger. "Guards! Remove this filth!" The boy's hands trembled, but his eyes, green as spring meadows, remained fixed on the king. There was something in those eyes. Not defiance, not exactly. Something else. Something hauntingly familiar that made the king raise his hand, stopping the guards mid-stride. "Let him approach," the king commanded, his voice betraying none of the turmoil churning within. Years of royal training had taught him to hide vulnerability like a shameful secret. The musicians stood frozen, their instruments silent in their hands. The jesters' bells no longer jingled. Even the servants paused, wine pitchers suspended in mid-pour. Time itself seemed to hold its breath as the boy took 5 more steps forward, each footfall echoing through the cavernous hall like a funeral drum. Then, with trembling fingers that seemed too young to carry such a burden, the boy began unwrapping the cloth. The fabric fell away in layers, like petals opening to reveal a terrible truth. First came a glint of metal, then the unmistakable curve of a hilt, and finally, horrifyingly, the full length of a sword that everyone in the room recognized instantly. The king's heart slammed against his ribs. His mouth went dry as desert sand. A roaring filled his ears as blood rushed to his head, making the room spin violently around him. That sword, that damned, beautiful sword, had belonged to his son. His only son. His missing son, whose absence had carved a void in the kingdom that no amount of feasting or merriment could ever fill. The sword's pommel caught the torchlight, the ruby embedded there glowing like a drop of fresh blood. The royal insignia etched into the blade seemed to pulse with accusation. How? How had this peasant boy come to possess the royal heir's most prized possession? The weapon that had vanished along with the prince 5 winters ago? "Where did you get that?" The king's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried across the silent hall as if he had screamed. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the arms of his throne, fighting the urge to lunge forward, to grab the sword, to shake answers from this boy, to collapse into tears, all at once. The instruments crashed to the floor as the musicians stepped back in horror. Nobles gasped. Ladies clutched their pearls. A wine glass shattered somewhere, the sound of breaking crystal oddly beautiful in the tense atmosphere. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but before a single word could escape his lips, the king's most trusted advisor lunged forward, his face contorted with rage. "Seize him!" he shouted, spittle flying from his thin lips. "This impostor dares to claim connection to our lost prince. This thief has stolen a royal relic." Chaos erupted like a dam breaking. Knights drew swords. Noblewomen shrieked. The boy stood frozen in the center of it all, still holding the prince's sword as if it were both treasure and burden. "Silence!" The king's voice thundered above the din, cracking with emotion he could no longer contain. He rose from his throne, the movement painful and deliberate, as if his body had aged decades in mere moments. Each step down from the dais sent shooting pain through his aging knees, but his eyes never left the sword. That beautiful, damned sword that had been crafted for his son's 16th name day. The last gift before disappearance, before loss, before grief became his only loyal subject. The boy did not cower as the king approached. Their eyes met, the peasant and the monarch, and something unspeakable passed between them. Recognition, impossible. Fear, perhaps. Truth, possibly the most dangerous thing of all. "Your Majesty," the boy finally spoke, his voice surprisingly steady for one so young standing before such power. "I never meant to cause distress. I only came to return what I believed should be restored to its rightful owner." The king stood mere inches from the boy now, close enough to see the dirt under his fingernails, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the worn patch on his shoulder where a packstrap had rubbed the fabric thin. So different from his son, who had been raised in silk and velvet, yet something in the way he held himself. "Where?" the king asked again, each word drawn out like a blade being unsheathed. "Did you find this sword?" Before the boy could answer, the advisor stepped between them, his ornate robes rustling like dry leaves. "My king, this is clearly a deception, an attempt to gain royal favor, perhaps even to claim the throne through trickery. We should have him executed immediately as an example." "I said silence," the king roared, grief transforming into rage in an instant. The hall fell deadly quiet once more. "I will hear his words." The advisor stepped back, bowing deeply, but his eyes glittered with something dangerous. Calculation, perhaps, or fear. The boy swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing beneath his thin neck. "A dying knight gave it to me, Your Majesty. 3 winters passed. He said to keep it safe until the time was right to return it." His voice cracked slightly. "He made me swear an oath." The king's world tilted on its axis. His vision narrowed until all he could see was the sword and the boy who held it. Everything else, the nobles, the hall, the kingdom itself, faded into insignificance. What came next would change everything. For him, for the boy, for the memory of a son whose fate remained unknown. "Guards," the king said, his voice suddenly calm, terrifyingly calm. "Take this boy to the east chamber. And let no one, not even you." He fixed his advisor with a stare cold enough to freeze flame. "Near him until I have heard his full story." As they led the boy away, the sword now in the king's trembling hands, whispers erupted throughout the hall like wildfire. No one noticed the strange smile that flickered briefly across the advisor's thin lips, nor the way the boy's eyes darted toward a serving girl who had suddenly gone pale as death itself. The great hall remained frozen in shock as the guards escorted the peasant boy away, his thin shoulders squared despite the weight of 100 contemptuous stares. Murmurs swelled like an approaching storm, nobles pressing gloved hands to painted lips, their whispers sharp as daggers. "An impostor! A thief! How dare he?" The boy's footsteps echoed against stone floors, each one carrying him deeper into the labyrinth of power he had foolishly entered. A thin film of sweat coated his palms as he clutched his worn tunic, acutely aware of the sword's absence. The royal guard's armor clinked rhythmically beside him, their faces impassive beneath steel helmets. Their gauntleted hands, capable of crushing his throat without effort, guided him through corridors adorned with tapestries depicting battles and victories that meant nothing to someone who had spent his life worrying about harvest yields and winter stores. The musty scent of ancient stone mingled with torch smoke, so different from the earthy smells of the village that had been his entire world until today. "I've done nothing wrong," he whispered, more to himself than to the guards. His voice cracked, betraying the terror that constricted his chest like an iron band. One guard, older than the rest, with eyes that had witnessed too many executions, gave him a sidelong glance that might have held a flicker of pity. "Truth means little within these walls, boy," the guard murmured, so quietly that only the peasant could hear. "Power decides what truth is." The east chamber, when they finally reached it, was spartanly furnished, a stark contrast to the opulence of the great hall. A simple wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow window too small for escape. No weapons on the walls, nothing that could be used to resist or flee. The door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid dropping into place, and the boy found himself alone with his pounding heart and racing thoughts. Outside in the corridor, the king dismissed all but his most trusted guards. "No one enters," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for question. "No one." His eyes lingered on his advisor, whose thin lips were pressed together in barely concealed displeasure. The advisor bowed deeply, a gesture of deference contradicted by the calculating gleam in his eyes. "As you wish, Your Majesty," he said smoothly, "though I must caution against giving this commoner any credence. The sword was likely stolen, and this tale of a dying knight spun from peasant imagination to avoid punishment." The king's fingers tightened around the hilt of his son's sword, the familiar weight of it both comfort and torment. 5 years had passed since his son had vanished during what should have been a routine hunting expedition. 5 years of searching, of false hopes, of prayers whispered into the darkness. 5 years of a kingdom holding its breath, waiting for a return that never came. "Leave me," the king ordered, his voice suddenly weary. The crown felt heavier than ever upon his brow, each jewel embedded in gold seeming to press into his skull. The advisor hesitated, then bowed again and retreated down the shadowed corridor, his silken robes whispering across the stone floor. Alone before the chamber door, the king closed his eyes for one unguarded moment. The sword in his hands had been crafted by the kingdom's finest swordsmith, balanced perfectly for his son's grip, the ruby in the pommel matching the royal seal. The prince had carried it proudly, had practiced with it daily in the courtyard, sunlight flashing off polished steel. The memory seared through the king's mind like a white-hot brand, his son laughing, alive, present. Inside the chamber, the peasant boy paced like a caged animal, 5 steps one way, 5 steps back. His rough-spun clothing looked even shabbier in the torchlight, patched elbows, frayed hem, the permanent soil stains of someone who worked the land. His hands, calloused and dirt-lined, twisted together anxiously. What madness had possessed him to approach the king? He should have left the sword buried beneath the floorboards of his tiny hut, should have kept his oath in silence until his dying day. The door swung open, and the boy nearly stumbled backward. The king entered alone, sword in hand, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Without the trappings of court ceremony standing in this plain room, the monarch seemed both more human and more terrifying, power stripped to its essence. "Sit," the king commanded, gesturing to one of the chairs. The boy obeyed instantly, perching on the edge as if prepared to flee. His eyes kept darting to the sword, now resting on the table between them like a physical manifestation of the gulf that separated commoner from royalty. "Tell me everything," the king said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out." The boy's throat constricted, a visible swallow moving down his thin neck. I was hunting, Your Majesty." "Not on royal lands," he added hastily. "Just in the small woods near our village. 2 winters ago, when the famine was at its worst." His hands trembled slightly at the memory. Everyone was hungry. My sisters were too weak to leave their beds. I had to find something, anything. The king's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He remembered that winter. remembered signing decrees to release grain stores, remembered reports of deaths in the outer villages, remembered his advisors cautioning against excessive generosity. I found him instead, the boy continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. A knight, badly wounded, sheltering in an abandoned woodcutter's hut. He wore no colors I recognized. His armor was plain, almost as if he didn't want to be identified. The boy's eyes took on a distant look, reliving the moment. He was dying. He knew it. I tried to help, brought him water, tried to clean his wounds, but... The boy's voice faltered. The king leaned forward imperceptibly, the legs of his chair scraping against the stone floor. He gave me the sword, the peasant said, his eyes meeting the king's directly for the first time. Wrapped it just as you saw it. Made me swear to keep it safe until I could return it to the royal family. Said it was more important than I could understand. A shiver passed visibly through his thin frame. He died before sunrise. I buried him as best I could. This night, the king said carefully, each word measured. Did he give you his name? The boy shook his head. No, your majesty, but he hesitated, uncertainty clouding his features. Speak freely, the king commanded, though tension had crept into his shoulders, muscles coiling like springs. He had a scar, the boy said hesitantly. Here. He traced a line from the corner of his right eye down to his jawline. The king's face drained of all color. The royal guard captain, his son's loyal shadow, had borne such a scar, a souvenir from a border skirmish years before. The captain who had disappeared along with the prince, presumed dead in whatever tragedy had befallen the hunting party. Why now? The king demanded, his voice rougher than intended. Why wait 2 years to bring this sword? The boy's gaze dropped to his dirt-encrusted fingernails. Fear, your majesty, he admitted. What would someone like me say to the castle guards? Who would believe me? I would have been hanged as a thief. His hands twisted together again. But then I heard about the feast, that the castle gates would be open for deliveries, and I heard... He swallowed hard. I heard the kingdom still mourned the lost prince, that the sword might bring some peace. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Outside the narrow window, twilight was gathering, purple shadows stealing across the kingdom. Somewhere in the castle, nobles would be speculating, rumors already spreading like wildfire. The boy who dared bring the lost prince's sword to court. The king who spoke to him alone, breaking all protocol. Do you know what happens to those who lie to the king? The monarch asked finally, his voice deceptively soft. The peasant's face paled, but he didn't look away. I imagine they die slowly, your majesty. Very slowly, the king confirmed. He stood abruptly, towering over the seated boy. You will remain here tonight. Guards will bring you food. Touch nothing. Attempt nothing. He picked up the sword, cradling it with unexpected tenderness. If your story proves false, you'll wish you had died in those woods with your dying knight. The threat hung in the air between them as the king turned to leave. At the door he paused, looking back at the trembling peasant. For an instant, just an instant, he saw something in the boy's profile, in the set of his jaw, in the way he held himself, despite his fear. Something hauntingly familiar that made his heart clench painfully in his chest. What is your name, boy? The king asked suddenly. Thomas, your majesty, the peasant replied. Son of William the miller. The king nodded once, sharply, and left without another word. The heavy door closed behind him with a sound of finality. In the corridor, a servant girl froze at the sight of the king, pressing herself against the wall in deference. Her eyes widened at the sight of the sword in his hands, and something like recognition flashed across her features before she lowered her gaze. The king barely noticed her, his mind too full of possibilities both wonderful and terrible. A dying knight with his captain's scar, a peasant boy with his son's sword. A truth that might shatter everything, or heal wounds 5 years festering. Meanwhile, in shadows further down the hall, the king's advisor watched with narrowed eyes, his thin fingers drumming thoughtfully against the wall. This unexpected development required careful handling, very careful indeed. Dawn crept hesitantly through the narrow window of the east chamber, its pale fingers stretching across stone floors worn smooth by centuries of royal intrigue. Thomas sat hunched on the edge of the simple wooden bed, his body stiff from a night of fitful sleep. Each creak in the ancient castle had jolted him awake, each shadow morphing into executioners in his exhausted imagination. The remnants of a modest meal, bread harder than the miller's stones, watery soup, and a cup of sour wine, sat untouched on the table. Fear had turned his stomach to knots. The heavy oak door swung open without warning. Thomas leapt to his feet, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. 2 guards entered, their expressions unreadable beneath their helmets, followed by the king himself. Gone was the ceremonial crown and ermine-trimmed cloak of the previous night's feast. Instead, the monarch wore a simple leather jerkin over a linen shirt, almost as if he wished to appear less intimidating. But power clung to him like an invisible mantle, impossible to disguise. "Come," the king commanded, his voice echoing against stone walls that still held the dampness of night. No explanation, no pleasantries, just a single word that Thomas knew better than to question. The guards flanked him as they marched through corridors bathed in early morning silence. Servants scurried past with downcast eyes, though Thomas caught their furtive glances, curiosity mingled with suspicion. Word had clearly spread throughout the castle. A peasant boy had brought the lost prince's sword, and the king himself had taken interest. In a place where gossip was currency, Thomas had unwittingly made himself valuable. They descended a narrow spiral staircase, the stone steps worn concave in the middle from countless footfalls across centuries. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying the distinct smell of old wood and parchment. Not the dungeons, then. Thomas released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his knotted shoulders loosening fractionally. The king led them to a heavy door bound with iron. A single guard stood sentinel, straightening to attention as they approached. With a respectful bow, he produced an ornate key from beneath his breastplate and unlocked the door. "Wait here," the king instructed the guards. His tone left no room for argument, though Thomas noticed the briefest hesitation in the older guard's stance. "I will speak with the boy alone." The chamber beyond was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, crammed with leather-bound tomes and scrolls tied with faded ribbons. The musty scent of ancient knowledge hung in the air, mingled with beeswax from the candles that provided the only illumination in the windowless room. At the center stood a massive oak table, its surface scarred and stained from years of use. Maps, documents, and a few small wooden figurines were arranged across it with deliberate precision. "The Royal Archives," the king explained, watching Thomas's wide-eyed wonder with something almost like amusement. "Few outside the royal family and our most trusted advisors have ever set foot here." Thomas swallowed hard. "Why show me, Your Majesty?" The king didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the table and placed both hands on its surface, leaning forward with the weariness of a man carrying an impossible burden. In the flickering candlelight, his face showed every line of grief and responsibility that 5 years of uncertainty had carved into it. "Because what you hold may be more valuable than gold," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Knowledge. Truth, perhaps." He straightened, fixing Thomas with a piercing stare. "And I must know if you truly understand what you've stumbled into." With deliberate movements, the king unrolled a yellowed map across the table. Thomas recognized the kingdom's boundaries, the forest where he hunted, the river that flowed past his village. The king's finger traced a path through the western woods, stopping at a small clearing marked with faded ink. 5 years ago," the king began, his voice taking on a hollow quality, "my son and a small hunting party departed for these woods, a routine expedition. They were due to return in 3 days. His finger tapped the parchment, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet chamber. They never did. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine despite the room's closeness. The lost prince. Everyone knew the story. How the kingdom's heir had vanished without a trace. How the king had sent search parties for months afterward. How rewards had been promised for any information. But those were tavern tales, distant tragedies that had little bearing on a miller's son more concerned with surviving each harvest. "We found 3 bodies," the king continued, his voice clinically detached, as if distance was the only way he could speak of it. 2 guards and a huntsman. Arrows in their backs, not the prince, not the captain of his guard. He looked up suddenly, his eyes boring into Thomas. "The captain with the scar you described." The room seemed to shrink around them. Thomas felt his mouth go dry, his palms suddenly slick with sweat. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear by all the gods, I didn't know who he was." "The sword my son carried," the king said, ignoring Thomas's protestation, "was unique. Commissioned for his 16th birthday. The royal insignia on the blade, the ruby in the pommel cut specifically to match our family seal." His eyes narrowed slightly. Not something easily counterfeited. Not something easily mistaken. The king moved to a shelf and pulled down a small wooden chest. It opened with a soft click, revealing a folded piece of cloth. He handled it with reverence, as if touching a holy relic. When he unfolded it on the table, Thomas saw it was a detailed drawing of a sword, the very sword he had kept hidden for 2 years. "I had this made after he disappeared," the king explained, his finger tracing the penned lines with something like tenderness. "Every detail recorded for the search parties. Every kingdom was notified. Every merchant, every blacksmith, every pawnbroker from here to the southern seas was told to watch for it." Thomas felt his legs weaken beneath him. "And now it's returned," he murmured. "Yes," the king agreed, his voice sharpening, "by a peasant boy with an extraordinary tale of a dying night in the woods." He leaned across the table, his face inches from Thomas's. "Do you understand now why I cannot simply take your word? Why every syllable you speak must be examined like a jeweler inspects for flaws?" Thomas nodded, his throat constricting. "What do you want from me, Your Majesty?" "Everything," the king replied simply. "Every detail you can remember about the night, his exact words, the wounds that killed him, the place you buried him." His voice caught slightly on the last words. "If what you say is true, you may have unknowingly buried one of my most loyal servants." Thomas closed his eyes, trying to summon memories he'd spent 2 years trying to forget. The ragged breathing of a dying man, the smell of infection and impending death, the weight of the sword being pressed into his reluctant hands. "He was fevered when I found him," Thomas began haltingly. "Arrow wounds in his side, festering. He tried to bind them himself, but..." He swallowed hard. He kept talking about duty, honor, how some oaths transcend death. The king's face remained impassive, but Thomas noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. "He made me swear on my mother's soul to keep the sword hidden until the time was right," Thomas continued. "Said that powerful men would kill for it, that its return must come when least expected." His voice dropped to a whisper. He said, "Tell the king his son made his choice freely." The chamber fell silent save for the soft hiss of candle wicks. The king's face had gone deathly pale, his eyes wide with an emotion Thomas couldn't name. Shock, perhaps, or a terrible understanding. "Those were his exact words?" the king demanded, his voice strained. Thomas nodded slowly. "I remember because they made no sense to me. Why would the king care about some stranger's son? I didn't know the sword was royal. I didn't understand any of it until..." He stopped abruptly, a new realization dawning. "Until I heard about the feast, that you still mourned your son after all these years." The king turned away suddenly, moving to a shadowed corner of the chamber where his face couldn't be seen. His shoulders rose and fell with carefully controlled breaths. When he spoke again, his voice was steady but distant, as if he were speaking from across a great chasm. "You will show me where you buried him," he said, "tonight, in secret." He turned back, his expression once again unreadable. "Until then, you will remain in the East Chamber. Speak to no one of what we've discussed." The implicit threat hung in the air between them. Thomas nodded, understanding perfectly what remained unsaid. Lies would mean death, but even truth might not guarantee safety. "Your Majesty," Thomas ventured as the king moved toward the door. The night before he died, he seemed at peace, as if completing his final duty brought him comfort. The king paused, his hand on the iron door handle. For a moment, his royal mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of the father beneath the monarch. a man hollowed by grief and sustained only by the faintest glimmer of hope. "Captain Roland never failed in his duty," he said quietly. "Not in life, and it seems, not even in death." The heavy door opened, and the guards snapped to attention. The king's face had already reassembled into its public persona, remote, authoritative, revealing nothing of the conversation that had just transpired. As Thomas was escorted back to his chamber, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just become a pawn in a game far larger and more dangerous than he could possibly comprehend. Behind them, in the now empty archive, a tapestry shifted almost imperceptibly as a hidden figure emerged from a concealed passage. The royal advisor's thin lips curved into a calculating smile as he silently closed the secret door through which he had overheard everything. Darkness had settled fully across the kingdom by the time Thomas was returned to his chamber. The single oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the stone walls, making the modest room seem both smaller and more ominous. His mind raced with everything that had transpired: the king's intense questioning, the revelation about Captain Roland, the planned secret expedition. Each new development pulled him deeper into a royal drama he'd never asked to join. The heavy wooden door creaked open just as Thomas had resigned himself to another night of fitful sleep. He jerked upright, expecting the guards or perhaps the king himself. Instead, a hooded figure slipped inside, movements quick and practiced like someone accustomed to moving undetected. Thomas scrambled backward until his shoulders hit the wall, heart hammering against his ribs. "Please," a female voice whispered urgently. "I mean no harm." The figure lowered her hood, revealing a woman perhaps 10 years Thomas's senior. Her face weathered but not unkind. Her hands were rough with calluses, working hands, not unlike his mother's. She wore the simple garb of a castle servant, a ring of keys fastened to her belt, the only indication of any status. "Who are you?" Thomas's voice cracked with tension. "My name is Eleanor," she replied, glancing nervously toward the door. "I've served in this castle since I was a girl, no higher than a table." There was something in her eyes. Fear, certainly, but something else too. Recognition. "I know about the sword." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "The king ordered me to speak to no one." A bitter smile flickered across Eleanor's features. "Of course he did." She moved closer, her voice dropping even lower. "Listen carefully, boy. I don't have much time. The guards change at midnight. They'll check on you then." The lamp's flame wavered as if disturbed by an unseen draft, sending shadows dancing across the woman's face. In that shifting light, Thomas noticed a small scar at her temple, partially hidden by wisps of graying hair, an old wound, long healed. "I knew him," Eleanor said simply. "The prince." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "You knew the prince?" Eleanor nodded, a strange mixture of fondness and grief crossing her features. Not as the court knew him, not as the royal heir draped in velvet and duty. Her voice softened with memory. "I knew him as a boy who would slip away from his tutors to sit in the kitchens, listening to servants' tales. A young man who borrowed stable hands' clothes to walk among the common folk in the market." Thomas felt a chill creep up his spine. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the sword you brought," her voice faltered slightly, "it wasn't just his weapon, it was his freedom." She glanced again at the door, clearly terrified of being discovered. "Before he disappeared, he asked me to help him hide it." Thomas's mind reeled with this revelation. The king had said nothing about the sword being hidden before the prince's disappearance. His confusion must have shown on his face. "The official story is that the prince took his sword on that final hunting trip," Eleanor explained, reading his expression. "That's what the king believes. What everyone believes. But it isn't true." Her hands twisted nervously in her apron. "2 nights before he left, he came to me. Said he needed to conceal something precious where his father's men wouldn't think to look." "Why would he hide his own sword?" Thomas asked, struggling to make sense of her story. Eleanor's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "Because he wasn't planning to return." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. He was tired of being a prince, of the endless politics and pretenses. He wanted to know what it meant to live as an ordinary man, to make his own choices. Thomas's heart pounded so loudly, he feared the guards outside might hear it. Then where did the sword I found come from? The dying knight, Captain Roland, he gave it to me himself. Roland was the only one who knew of the prince's plan, Eleanor whispered. He had sworn to protect the prince since childhood, not just his life, but his happiness. She moved to the small window, peering out at the stars as if seeking guidance from them. When the prince didn't return from that hunting trip, when the other guards were found dead, Roland must have retrieved the sword from where we'd hidden it. Why? Thomas pressed, drawn into her story despite his misgivings. Insurance, perhaps, Eleanor said distantly. Proof of life, or death. Or maybe, she hesitated, maybe he hoped to return it to the prince someday. She turned back to Thomas, eyes suddenly sharp with intensity. What exactly did Roland tell you when he gave you the sword? Thomas closed his eyes, summoning the memory he'd recounted to the king only hours before. He said to keep it hidden until the time was right, that powerful men would kill for it. He swallowed hard, and to tell the king that his son made his choice freely. Eleanor covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes closing briefly as if in pain or perhaps prayer. So it's true, she whispered. He lives. The prince. Thomas felt dizzy with the implications. Are you saying the prince is alive somewhere? That he abandoned the kingdom? His father? Abandoned or escaped? Eleanor countered softly. Not everyone born to power desires it, boy. She moved suddenly, crossing to Thomas and gripping his arm with surprising strength. Listen to me. Tomorrow when the king takes you to find Roland's grave, you'll be in danger. Thomas's blood ran cold. From the king? Eleanor shook her head. From those who've built their power in the prince's absence. Lord Aldrich, the king's advisor, has positioned himself as heir presumptive these 5 years. The return of the prince, or even proof of his deliberate disappearance, would destroy everything he's worked for. The pieces began to fall into place in Thomas's mind. The advisor's thinly veiled hostility at the feast, the guard's reluctance to leave the king alone with him. Does the king know about Lord Aldrich? The king sees what he wishes to see, Eleanor said bitterly. Grief has narrowed his vision. She released Thomas's arm, stepping back toward the door. I've stayed too long already, but you needed to know the truth. About the sword, about the prince. Her expression softened slightly. Roland was a good man, the best of men. He wouldn't have entrusted the sword to you without reason. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders like a physical burden. What should I do? Be careful what you reveal to the king, Eleanor advised. His grief makes him dangerous, unpredictable. She pulled her hood back over her head, once again becoming a nondescript shadow. And whatever happens, don't let Lord Aldrich get you alone. Wait, Thomas called softly as she reached for the door. Why tell me all this? Why risk yourself for a stranger? Eleanor paused, her hand on the latch. For a moment, the brave facade cracked, revealing a vulnerability that startled Thomas with its rawness. Because I served the prince since he was a boy with skinned knees and nightmares. Because I helped him escape a life that was suffocating him. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. And because I promised Roland that if he never returned, I would protect what he valued most. Before Thomas could respond, she slipped out as silently as she had entered, leaving him alone with revelations that transformed everything he thought he knew. The sword wasn't merely a lost royal artifact. It was the key to a mystery far more complex than a prince's disappearance. It was the physical embodiment of a choice that had fractured the kingdom's future. Thomas sank onto the edge of the bed, his mind spinning with possibilities. If Eleanor spoke the truth, then Captain Roland's dying words took on new meaning. The prince hadn't been kidnapped or murdered. He had chosen exile over inheritance, freedom over duty. And somehow, Thomas had become the unwitting custodian of this explosive truth. Outside the narrow window, clouds drifted across the moon, plunging the castle grounds into deeper shadow. Somewhere within those stone walls, a king mourned a son who might not be dead. An advisor plotted to protect his path to power, and a servant woman carried secrets that could bring the entire kingdom crashing down. As the midnight bell tolled, signaling the changing of the guards, Thomas made his decision. Tomorrow, when the king took him to Roland's grave, he would carefully navigate the dangerous waters between truth and survival. He would honor the oath he'd made to a dying knight, but he would also protect himself from becoming a casualty in a royal game he never asked to play. What he couldn't know, as exhaustion finally pulled him toward restless sleep, was that Eleanor had already disappeared from the castle, her chamber empty, her few possessions gone, and that Lord Aldrich's men were already searching for a servant woman who had abandoned her post without explanation, leaving only rumors and questions in her wake. Dawn broke reluctantly over the castle walls, thin fingers of pale gold light stretching across a sky heavy with unshed rain. Thomas stood in the courtyard beside 4 horses, his borrowed cloak too fine for his peasant frame. The fabric, wool far softer than anything his family had ever owned, felt foreign against his skin, a constant reminder of how far he had strayed from his place in the world. He shifted his weight from one foot to another, acutely aware of the guard's suspicious stares. The king emerged from the keep without fanfare, dressed in simple riding clothes that disguised his station. Only the straightness of his spine and the imperious tilt of his head marked him as royalty. Behind him walked Lord Aldrich, his thin lips pressed into a bloodless line of displeasure. The advisor's presence sent a jolt of anxiety through Thomas's chest, Eleanor's warnings echoing in his mind like distant thunder. "Your Majesty," Lord Aldrich's voice carried across the courtyard, measured and reasonable. "I must again advise against this expedition. To venture beyond the walls with only 2 guards, based solely on this boy's word." "Your concerns are noted, Aldrich." The king cut him off, his tone making it clear the matter was settled. "The fewer who know of this journey, the better." Lord Aldrich bowed stiffly, but Thomas caught the flash of calculation in his eyes, cold and reptilian. "Then at least allow me to accompany you. My counsel may prove valuable if complications arise." The king hesitated, and Thomas saw his opportunity slipping away. If Lord Aldrich joined them, any chance of speaking freely with the king would vanish. Worse, if Eleanor's warnings held truth, Thomas might not return from the forest at all. "Your Majesty," Thomas spoke up, surprising himself with his boldness. "The hut where I found the knight is small, barely room for 2 men to stand. 4 of us would already be a crowd." He swallowed hard, feeling Lord Aldrich's venomous gaze fix upon him. "And the path there is narrow, difficult to navigate with too many riders." The king studied Thomas's face, something like amusement flickering briefly in his eyes. "The boy speaks sense, Aldrich. You will remain and manage court affairs in my absence." His tone softened slightly at his advisor's obvious displeasure. "We shall return by nightfall." Lord Aldrich bowed again, deeper this time, a perfect performance of deference that didn't reach his eyes. "As you wish, Your Majesty." He straightened, casting one final, measuring glance at Thomas. "Safe travels." As they mounted their horses and rode through the castle gates, Thomas felt a weight lift from his chest. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Lord Aldrich wasn't finished, that even now the advisor might be setting other plans in motion. The sensation of being watched followed him as their small party crossed the drawbridge and turned toward the western forest. The king rode beside Thomas, while the 2 guards, hardened men with weathered faces and watchful eyes, followed at a respectful distance. Close enough to protect their monarch, far enough to allow private conversation. The countryside opened before them, fields of early wheat bending in the morning breeze, peasants already at work with scythes and hoes. They straightened as the royal party passed, bowing deeply, curiosity evident in their expressions. "They wonder why their king rides with a miller's son," the king observed, his voice carefully neutral. "Rumor spreads faster than plague in a kingdom." Thomas kept his eyes fixed between his horse's ears, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "What will you tell them, Your Majesty, when we return?" "That depends entirely on what we find, doesn't it?" The king's gaze was heavy upon Thomas's profile. "And on whether your tale proves true." They rode in silence after that, following the main road until the settlements grew sparser, the cultivated fields giving way to wild meadows and, eventually, the dark line of the western forest. Thomas felt a strange tightening in his chest as they approached the woods, part homecoming, part dread. Somewhere beneath those ancient boughs lay Captain Roland's remains, the final physical link to a truth that threatened to upend the kingdom. "Here," Thomas said as they reached a barely visible game trail leading into the trees. "We must leave the horses and continue on foot." The king nodded to his guards, who dismounted and secured the horses to a nearby oak. One guard took the lead, hand resting on his sword hilt as he scanned the forest for potential threats. The king followed, with Thomas beside him and the second guard bringing up the rear. The formation left Thomas effectively trapped between royal protectors. The forest enfolded them in green-tinted silence, broken only by their footfalls on the soft earth and the occasional call of a startled bird. Dappled sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns that seemed to Thomas like nature's own conspiracy, revealing and concealing in equal measure. The rich smell of decomposing leaves and new growth filled his nostrils, grounding him in memories of countless hunting trips. "How much farther?" the king asked after they had walked for nearly an hour, deeper into the forest than most hunters or woodcutters ever ventured. "Just beyond that ridge," Thomas replied, pointing to a slight rise ahead. "There's a clearing where an old charcoal burner's hut stands. That's where I found him." As they crested the ridge, the small clearing came into view. The hut was little more than a crude shelter, walls of stacked stone supporting a sagging roof of branches and sod. Time and weather had not been kind to it. Part of the roof had collapsed inward, and saplings had begun to reclaim the clearing's edges. The king halted, his face suddenly pale beneath his short beard. "This place," he murmured, almost to himself. "I know this place." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the forest's cool shade. "Your Majesty, the royal hunting grounds extend 10 miles southwest of here," the king said distantly, his eyes fixed on the ruined hut. "My son and I hunted these woods many times when he was younger." A muscle worked in his jaw. He knew these forests better than my own huntsman. The implications hung in the air between them. If the prince had planned his disappearance, as Eleanor claimed, he would have needed a route and destination unknown to his father's searchers. What better path than one that led through familiar woods to their very edges, and then beyond? "Where did you bury him?" the king asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Thomas led them around the hut to where a small mound of stones stood beneath an ancient oak. 5 seasons of wind and rain had settled the earth, and forest moss had begun to creep across the stones, nature's quiet reclamation. Thomas knelt beside the grave, a strange mixture of emotions tightening his throat: respect for the man whose last act had been to entrust him with a royal secret, fear of what uncovering that secret might mean. "Here," he said simply. "I had no shovel, so I dug with my hands and covered him with stones to keep the animals away." The memory rose unbidden, his fingernails split and bleeding, the night's unseeing eyes, the impossible weight of the sword that had been pressed into his unwilling hands. The king approached slowly, as if walking in a dream or a nightmare. He knelt opposite Thomas, one gloved hand reaching out to touch the cairn. For a moment his royal mask slipped entirely, revealing a grief so raw and personal that Thomas had to look away. This was not the distant sorrow of a king for a loyal servant, but the anguish of a man confronting a tangible link to his own devastating loss. "We should uncover him," the lead guard said gruffly, practical despite the charged atmosphere. To confirm the boy's story, the king nodded wordlessly, and the guards began carefully removing the stones. Thomas watched, heart pounding in his chest. Soon they would find Roland's remains, still wrapped in his cloak as Thomas had left him. They would see the scar the king had described, would find final confirmation of Thomas's truthfulness. But what then? What would the king do with the knowledge that his son had chosen to disappear, had rejected his birthright and responsibilities? As the guards worked, Thomas became aware of the forest's unnatural silence. The birds had stopped calling. Even the ever-present rustle of leaves had stilled, as if the woodland itself was holding its breath. He scanned the surrounding trees, the hairs on the back of his neck rising in primitive warning. "Your Majesty," he whispered urgently, "something's wrong." The king raised his head, instantly alert, hand moving to the sword at his belt. The guards froze, heads turning in unison toward the forest's edge. For 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. Then a crossbow bolt hissed through the clearing, striking the lead guard in the chest with devastating accuracy. He dropped without a sound, dead before he hit the ground. The second guard shoved the king behind him, drawing his sword with practiced speed, but a second bolt caught him in the throat, turning his war cry into a wet, terrible gurgle. "Run!" Thomas shouted, grabbing the king's arm and pulling him toward the dense undergrowth on the clearing's far side. Survival instinct overrode all protocol and propriety, the miller's son dragging the monarch like a child fleeing a burning house. As they crashed through the brush, Thomas heard the unmistakable sounds of pursuit, multiple sets of footsteps, the metallic clink of weapons. Not bandits, whose attacks would be chaotic and opportunistic. These were trained men, moving with purpose and precision. Behind them, in the now empty clearing, the royal guards lay dead beside Captain Roland's disturbed grave, and the forest kept its ancient silence, witness once again to violence enacted in the name of power and ambition. Thomas's lungs burned as he pulled the king deeper into the forest, away from the clearing where death had arrived with such swift precision. Branches whipped at their faces, roots threatened to trip their desperate flight, but fear drove them forward with animal instinct. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, methodical, unhurried, the confidence of hunters who knew their prey couldn't escape. "Wait!" the king gasped, pulling his arm free from Thomas's grip. He braced himself against an ancient oak, chest heaving with exertion. Despite his relatively simple attire, he was still dressed as nobility, boots meant for stirrups rather than woodland flight, a cloak whose weight and fabric prioritized appearance over function. "We can't outrun them like this." Thomas scanned the forest frantically, his peasant's knowledge of the woods, suddenly the most valuable currency either of them possessed. "There," he whispered, pointing to a narrow ravine half hidden by undergrowth. "The stream at the bottom leads to caves. We might lose them there." The king nodded, no trace of royal pride or hesitation in his expression, just the grim determination of a man fighting for survival. Thomas led the way, sliding down the steep embankment on his heels, using saplings to control his descent. The king followed with surprising agility, though a grimace of pain crossed his features when he landed. "Your ankle?" Thomas asked, noticing the king's uneven stance. "Never mind that," the king dismissed, already scanning the ravine for threats. Those were no common bandits. The accuracy, the silence, those were trained killers. Thomas felt cold certainty settle in his gut. "Lord Aldrich." The king's eyes narrowed, but he didn't immediately reject the accusation. "What makes you so sure?" "The servant woman, Eleanor," Thomas said quickly, aware that each moment standing still increased their danger. "She came to my chamber last night, said the advisor had positioned himself as your heir these 5 years, that the sword's return threatened everything he'd built." Anger flashed across the king's face. "You spoke with a servant? After I explicitly—" "She found me," Thomas interrupted, desperation overriding deference. "She said she knew the prince, that she helped him hide the sword before he disappeared." The rushing stream nearly drowned his next words. "She said he chose to leave, Your Majesty, that he wasn't taken or killed." The king's face drained of color, and for a terrifying moment, Thomas feared he might collapse. Instead, he straightened, something hardening in his expression. "We need to move. Now." They waded into the shallow stream, the icy mountain water numbing their feet and ankles. Thomas led them downstream, where the water would hide their scent and tracks from any hounds their pursuers might employ. The ravine walls grew steeper, the forest canopy above nearly closing completely, casting them in green-tinted twilight despite the morning hour. "The caves should be just ahead," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible above the stream's gentle murmur. "My father showed them to me years ago. Said they were used during the border wars to hide villagers from raiders." The king's eyes remained alert, scanning their surroundings with the practiced vigilance of a man trained for warfare. "Your father taught you well." "He died 3 winters ago," Thomas replied, a sudden lump in his throat. Never saw beyond the borders of his own fields, but he knew every root and stone within them. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, crossed the king's features. "A good man, then." "The best," Thomas said simply, then pointed ahead. There. The stream bed curved sharply, revealing a dark opening in the ravine wall, partially obscured by hanging vines and moss. Without hesitation, Thomas led the way inside, the temperature dropping noticeably as they entered the cave's mouth. The space opened wider than it appeared from outside, the ceiling high enough that even the king could stand upright. Daylight filtered through the entrance, providing just enough illumination to reveal rough stone walls worn smooth by ancient waters. "We should be safe here, at least until dark," Thomas said, keeping his voice low. "The entrance is nearly invisible unless you know where to look." The king moved deeper into the cave, his royal bearing incongruous in such primeval surroundings. He lowered himself onto a flat stone, finally allowing a wince of pain as he extended his injured ankle. "Your servant woman," he said after a moment of silence. "Eleanor. What else did she tell you?" Thomas hesitated, weighing truth against survival. In the half-light of the cave, the king seemed both more and less than his title, a man stripped of ceremony and protection, yet still carrying the weight of a crown even in its physical absence. The dead guards in the clearing were stark evidence of the danger engulfing them both. "She said Captain Roland was the only one who knew of the prince's plan," Thomas finally said, choosing honesty despite its risks. "That he protected not just the prince's life, but his happiness." The words felt strange on his tongue, the concept almost heretical, that duty to someone's soul might supersede duty to their station. The king's eyes closed briefly, pain etching deeper lines into his face. "Roland served my family for 20 years. I trusted him with my son's life." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I never considered I should also trust his judgment about my son's future." Thomas remained silent, sensing the king was speaking more to himself than to his unlikely companion. 5 years, the king continued, his voice hollow with remembered grief. 5 years searching for assassins, conspiracies, foreign plots. Never once did I consider. He couldn't finish the thought, the possibility too painful to articulate, that he chose to leave. Thomas completed gently. The king's eyes snapped open, a flash of royal fury quickly contained. "You speak of matters beyond your understanding, boy." "Perhaps," Thomas acknowledged, emboldened by their shared danger. "Or perhaps an ordinary life is exactly what I understand, while you cannot fathom why anyone would choose it over a crown." The words hung between them in the cool cave air, dangerous in their directness. For a moment, Thomas feared he had overstepped fatally, that even here, hunted, injured, stripped of guards, the king's wrath would fall upon him. Instead, something unexpected happened. The king laughed, a short, bitter sound devoid of humor. "Bold words from a miller's son," he said, but without rancor. "Tell me then, in your ordinary wisdom, why would a prince abandon everything? Power, wealth, the chance to shape a kingdom?" Thomas thought of his own simple life. The daily rhythm of the mill, his mother's cooking, his sister's laughter, the uncomplicated pleasure of a day's honest work completed. "Perhaps because a crown is also a cage," he suggested. "Perhaps your son wanted to know who he might be if his worth wasn't measured by his birthright." The king stared at Thomas with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "You speak as if you knew him." "I didn't," Thomas said truthfully. "But I know what it's like to wonder about a different life. Every peasant boy has gazed at the castle and imagined himself a knight or noble." He smiled faintly. Perhaps a prince might look at a peasant's fire and envy its simplicity. A noise outside froze them both, the faintest displacement of water, a sound too deliberate for wildlife. The king's hand moved instantly to his sword hilt, while Thomas pressed himself against the cave wall, straining to see through the vine-covered entrance. Shadows moved across the filtered light, men moving downstream, hunting methodically. "They're tracking us," the king whispered, his breath warm against Thomas's ear. "They'll find the cave eventually." "There's another way out," Thomas replied softly, recalling his father's long-ago lessons. "A tunnel system that leads to the hillside above, but we'll need light to find it." The king reached inside his tunic, producing a small fire starter, flint, steel, and tinder wrapped in oiled leather. One benefit of royal training, he explained at Thomas's surprised look. A king must always be prepared. They moved deeper into the cave, where the king quickly struck sparks onto the tinder. A tiny flame bloomed in the darkness, which he transferred to a pine branch Thomas had retrieved from the cave floor. The modest torch cast wavering shadows across the limestone walls as they pressed forward into the earth's embrace. "If we survive this," the king said suddenly, his voice echoing slightly in the narrowing passage, "what will you do? Return to your mill as if none of this happened?" Thomas hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead. "I'm not sure there's a place for me there anymore," he admitted. "Not after being dragged into royal matters. Village folk are suspicious of those who've been touched by power, even unwillingly." The king nodded, understanding in his expression. "And I cannot return to my throne without confronting what we've learned." His voice hardened with resolve. "If Aldrich has indeed betrayed me, he will answer for the blood spilled today." They paused at a fork in the tunnel, Thomas trying to remember his father's descriptions from years ago. The left passage seemed to slope gently upward, which matched what he recalled. "This way, I think." As they continued, the sound of water faded behind them, replaced by the eerie silence of deep earth. Neither spoke again for some time, each lost in thoughts of what awaited them if they escaped. A kingdom in turmoil, a throne undermined, a missing prince who might never want to be found. And somewhere behind them, moving with lethal purpose through forest and stream, men whose orders were clear: ensure that neither the miller's son nor the king himself survived to reveal what they had discovered at Captain Roland's grave. The torch flickered treacherously as they navigated the winding tunnel, its meager light barely pushing back the absolute darkness that pressed in from all sides. Limestone walls glistened with moisture, occasionally narrowing so severely that both men had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The air grew thin and stale the deeper they ventured, carrying the musty scent of earth undisturbed for generations. Thomas led the way, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall for guidance. Each step was a gamble, his childhood memories of his father's stories increasingly suspect as the tunnel branched and twisted. The torch wouldn't last much longer. Already the flame was shrinking, feeding on the last remnants of resin in the pine branch. "Are you certain this is the right path?" the king asked, his voice tight with controlled anxiety. The close confines of the tunnel had stripped away another layer of his royal composure, revealing the vulnerable man beneath the crown. "No," Thomas admitted, seeing no point in false confidence. "My father only brought me to the cave entrance. The rest I know only from his tales." He paused, listening intently. "But I think I feel a draft, air moving from somewhere ahead." They pressed on, the king's limp becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. Thomas noticed but said nothing. What comfort could a miller's son offer a monarch? Instead, he focused on the increasing strength of the air current, cool and faintly fresh against his face. "There," he whispered, pointing to a faint lightening in the darkness ahead. "I think that's it." The passage angled sharply upward, requiring them to use hands and feet to climb the increasingly steep slope. The king's breath came in harsh gasps, his injured ankle clearly causing him significant pain, but he refused to slow their pace. Thomas reached back once to offer assistance and was met with a glare of such fierce pride that he quickly withdrew his hand. "I've led armies into battle and survived 3 assassination attempts," the king muttered through gritted teeth. "I will not be defeated by a hole in the ground." The light grew stronger, resolving into a roughly circular opening, partially obscured by roots and fallen debris. Thomas reached it first, pushing aside tangled vegetation to reveal a view of forested hillside. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled patterns across the forest floor. He pulled himself out, then turned to help the king, who this time accepted the assistance with grim acknowledgement of necessity. They emerged on a steep slope overlooking a valley neither recognized immediately. The cave exit was well concealed by undergrowth. Anyone passing within 20 paces would miss it entirely. Thomas oriented himself using the sun's position, calculating roughly how far they had traveled underground. "We're northeast of where we entered," he said with growing confidence. "That would put us—" He squinted, identifying a familiar peak in the distance. "At least 4 miles from where we left the horses." which we cannot retrieve without risking Aldrich's men, the king finished, scanning their surroundings with the tactical eye of a battle-seasoned ruler. And we must assume the castle is equally unsafe. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool forest air. Where can we go? The king was silent for a long moment, his face a mask of calculation and barely contained fury. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, harder, more resolute. There is a hunting lodge 3 leagues east of here, built by my grandfather, used rarely enough that few remember its existence. My son and I stayed there often when he was younger. Will it be safe? Thomas asked, doubt evident in his tone. No place is truly safe now, the king replied grimly. But it's defensible, stocked with emergency provisions, and, most importantly, known only to the royal family and their closest confidants. His expression darkened. Aldrich was never among those trusted with its location. They began their journey east, moving as quickly as the king's injury allowed. The forest grew denser here, ancient trees creating a cathedral-like canopy that reduced the afternoon sun to thin golden spears piercing the shadows. Thomas found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, each snapping twig or rustling leaf triggering a spike of fear. The image of the royal guards, one moment alive, the next crumpling lifelessly to the forest floor, replayed ceaselessly in his mind. You think quickly for a miller's son, the king observed after they had walked in silence for nearly an hour. Most peasants would have frozen in panic when those bolts flew. Thomas shrugged uncomfortably. Hunger teaches quick thinking. When your family's survival depends on whether you return with game or empty-handed, you learn to react, not think. The king nodded, a strange respect in his eyes. What of your family now? Will they worry for your absence? My mother and sisters, Thomas replied, an ache of longing suddenly constricting his throat. They'll worry, yes, but they're strong, stronger than I am in many ways. He managed a wry smile, and they're used to my occasional hunting trips lasting longer than planned, but not to their son and brother being entangled in royal plots, the king added with unexpected perception. No, Thomas agreed softly, not to that. They continued eastward, the forest gradually changing character, pine and spruce giving way to oak and maple as they descended into more temperate elevations. The king moved with surprising woodcraft for a monarch, stepping carefully to minimize noise, choosing paths that offered cover. Thomas realized with a jolt that he was seeing the man who had raised a prince, not just a ruler, but a father who had once taught his son these same skills. Your Majesty, Thomas ventured as daylight began to fade, the servant Eleanor. She spoke as if she was close to the prince, as if she knew his mind. The king's stride faltered almost imperceptibly. Eleanor, he repeated, testing the name. Tall woman, gray-streaked hair. Thomas nodded. She wore a ring of keys at her belt. The head chambermaid, the king said, recognition dawning. She served the royal apartment since before my son was born. His expression grew distant, remembering. She was one of the few servants he didn't treat as furniture. Always had time for her stories, even as he grew older. A humorless laugh escaped him. I reprimanded him once for spending too much time in the servants' quarters, said it wasn't befitting his station. The revelation hung between them, another small piece of the puzzle that was the missing prince. A young man who sought connection with those his station commanded him to ignore, who perhaps found more authenticity below stairs than in the performative world of court. She's gone, Thomas said quietly. Disappeared from the castle after speaking to me. The king absorbed this without visible reaction, though his pace increased slightly. If she truly helped my son with whatever plan he enacted, then she's wise to flee. Aldrich would show no mercy to anyone who aided the prince's disappearance, real or perceived. As twilight deepened into true darkness, the king finally halted in a small clearing. The lodge is less than a mile ahead, but we'd be fools to approach in darkness. Too easy to blunder into traps or sentries if Aldrich somehow knows of it. They made a crude camp beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, neither daring to risk a fire. The night air carried the first bite of autumn chill, and Thomas found himself shivering despite the exertion of their journey. The king noticed and, without comment, unclasped his cloak, and tossed it to the miller's son. "Your Majesty, I can't." "Take it," the king cut him off. "Your peasant sensibilities can survive the indignity of royal charity for one night." "I have less need of it than you." Thomas wrapped the fine wool around his shoulders, immediately warmer. "Thank you," he said simply. They ate a meager meal of berries and nuts Thomas had gathered along their route, neither speaking much as night fully claimed the forest. Owls called in the darkness, and somewhere distant a wolf howled, lonely, haunting sounds that emphasized their isolation. "What will you do?" Thomas finally asked, "if Eleanor spoke the truth? If your son chose to leave?" The king was silent so long that Thomas thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice carried the weight of a question he had avoided for 5 years. "I don't know," he admitted, the 3 words seeming to cost him greatly. "All this time, I've sustained myself with the belief that he was taken from me, that somewhere he needed rescuing." His hands clenched into fists in the darkness. The alternative, that he chose to abandon his birthright, his responsibilities, his family. His voice broke slightly on the last word. "Perhaps he didn't see it as abandonment," Thomas suggested gently. "Perhaps he saw it as the only way to become the man he needed to be, rather than the prince you needed him to be." The king's head snapped up, eyes flashing with momentary anger in the faint moonlight that filtered through the branches above. But the fury died as quickly as it had sparked, replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. "You have an uncomfortable habit of speaking truth, Thomas Miller's son," he said quietly. Before Thomas could respond, a sound froze them both. The unmistakable crack of a branch breaking under a careless foot, not 50 paces from where they sat. The king's hand moved instantly to his sword hilt, while Thomas pressed himself against the oak's massive trunk, straining to pierce the darkness with inadequate human sight. Another sound followed, the soft metallic clink of weapons or armor, barely audible but unmistakable to men whose lives now depended on such perceptions. They weren't alone in the forest. Whether Aldrich's assassins had somehow tracked them through the cave system or simply guessed their likely route, the result was the same. The hunt continued. The king leaned close, his breath warm against Thomas's ear. "The lodge is northeast through those pines," he whispered, barely audible. "Stone walls, defensible. If we're separated, head there." Thomas nodded, heart pounding so loudly he feared it might betray their position. The night suddenly seemed alive with threats, every shadow a potential assassin, every rustle of leaves a step closer to death. The king slowly drew his sword, the well-oiled blade making no sound as it cleared the scabbard. "Ready yourself," the king breathed. "When I give the signal, run for the pines. Don't look back." Thomas clutched the royal cloak around his shoulders, knowing its warmth might soon cost him his life. But there was no time to discard it now. He tensed, muscles coiled like a hunted deer preparing to bolt. The forest held its breath around them, seconds stretching into an eternity of suspense. And then the night exploded into violence. "Now!" the king hissed, shoving Thomas toward the pines as he simultaneously lunged in the opposite direction, his sword gleaming like captured moonlight as it arced through the darkness. Thomas's body responded before his mind fully processed the command, propelling him forward into the undergrowth. Behind him came the unmistakable sounds of steel meeting steel. The king had found his target. Or it had found him. Branches whipped against Thomas's face as he crashed through the forest, the royal cloak tangling around his legs, nearly sending him sprawling. He ripped it free from his shoulders without slowing, leaving the fine fabric snagged on a thorny bush. A shout echoed through the trees, not the king's voice, but someone in pain. Good. At least the monarch wasn't defenseless. Thomas forced himself to keep moving toward the pines, marking the direction of the lodge, though every instinct screamed to turn back. What could a miller's son do against trained killers? Yet abandoning the king felt like a betrayal worse than any crime. The forest floor dipped suddenly, and Thomas lost his footing on the treacherous slope. He tumbled forward, unable to check his momentum, rolling painfully through brush and over exposed roots until he fetched up hard against a fallen log. The impact drove the breath from his lungs in an explosive gasp. Pain lanced through his side. A broken rib, perhaps, or just badly bruised. He lay still for precious seconds, struggling to refill his lungs, ears straining for sounds of pursuit. Voices carried from the direction he'd fled, urgent, angry whispers he couldn't quite make out. Then a clear command: "Find the boy. The king is worthless to us without him." Worthless without him. The words made no sense to Thomas's fear-addled mind, but their implication was clear enough. He needed to keep moving, or the king would die. He forced himself upright, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side, and oriented himself once more toward the northeast. The pines, the lodge, safety, if such a thing still existed in this nightmare. He moved more cautiously now, placing each foot with deliberate care to minimize noise. The forest had become an obstacle course of shadows and deceptions, moonlight creating false pathways while obscuring real ones. Thomas relied on his lifetime of woodland experience, choosing routes that would leave minimal trace of his passage, over rock outcroppings, through shallow streams, beneath low-hanging branches where disturbed undergrowth wouldn't betray him. The density of pines increased, their sharp scent filling his nostrils as he pushed through their lower branches. The lodge must be close. But what if Aldrich's men had already found it? What if this whole night was just an elaborate funnel driving them toward a prepared trap? A rustle in the darkness ahead froze Thomas mid-step. He dropped instantly into a crouch, making himself as small as possible behind the nearest tree trunk. 20 paces ahead, a figure moved among the pines, too deliberate for wildlife, too cautious for an innocent traveler. One of Aldrich's assassins, cutting off his route to the lodge. Thomas weighed his options, each less appealing than the last. He carried no weapon beyond a small skinning knife, useless against a trained soldier. Doubling back risked running directly into the main pursuit. Waiting meant giving the king's enemies more time to find them both. He needed a distraction. His hand closed around a fist-sized rock beside his foot. Not much, but perhaps enough. He took careful aim at a dense thicket 30 paces to the assassin's right, then hurled the rock with all the strength his aching body could muster. It crashed through the branches with a satisfying commotion, sounding remarkably like a man trying to flee while panicked. The assassin reacted instantly, darting toward the noise with sword drawn. Thomas seized his moment, sprinting silently across the gap in the opposite direction, heart hammering against his injured ribs. He didn't stop until he'd put several hundred paces between himself and the spot, certain the man would quickly realize the deception. The trees began to thin, and suddenly, Thomas found himself at the edge of a small clearing. There, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, stood a structure of solid stone, 2 stories tall, with narrow windows and a single heavy door. The Royal Hunting Lodge. He approached cautiously, scanning for signs of occupation or ambush. The building stood dark and silent, apparently untouched. At the door he hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Should he enter? Wait for the king? What if the monarch had already fallen to Aldrich's men? A twig snapped in the forest behind him. Decision made. Thomas pushed against the door, finding it unlocked. He slipped inside, easing it shut behind him with barely a sound. The interior was pitch black, the air heavy with the smell of disuse, dust and old ashes, leather and dried herbs. He stood motionless, allowing his eyes to adjust while listening intently for any sound suggesting he wasn't alone. Gradually, shapes emerged from the darkness. A large central room with a stone fireplace, wooden furniture draped in cloths to protect from dust. A table, chairs, weapon racks now empty. A staircase leading to a second floor. Windows shuttered from within. A defensible position, as the king had said, if Thomas could bar the door. He felt his way to the entrance, fingers finding a heavy wooden beam designed to slot into brackets across the door. It took all his strength to lift it into place, his injured side protesting with each movement. With the door secured, he moved through the lodge, checking each corner and shadow. The ground floor appeared empty. The second floor contained sleeping quarters, 4 small rooms with simple beds, all unoccupied. Returning downstairs, Thomas debated lighting a fire. The lodge's thick stone walls would mostly contain the light, but any smoke from the chimney might be visible to searching eyes. Cold won out over caution. The autumn night had chilled him to the bone, and his soaked clothing clung to his skin like a second frigid layer. He found tinder and logs stacked beside the hearth, along with flint and steel on the mantelpiece. The fire caught quickly, trained by expert hands before being abandoned to time. Thomas kept it small, just enough to cast a warm glow across the central room and chase the worst of the chill from his aching body. He removed his sodden outer clothes, hanging them near enough to the flames to dry without burning. As warmth gradually returned to his limbs, so too did the full weight of his situation. The king might be dead. Assassins roamed the forest, and Thomas himself was now barricaded in a royal lodge he had no right to enter, having fled the only man who could legitimize his presence there. If Aldrich's men found him here alone, they would execute him without question or mercy. A sound outside jolted him from his dark thoughts. Footsteps on the path leading to the lodge. Heavy, uneven steps, not trying to hide their approach. Thomas quickly grabbed an iron poker from beside the fireplace, the closest thing to a weapon he could find. He positioned himself beside the door, poker raised, heart pounding against his injured ribs. "Thomas?" The king's voice, rough with exertion and pain. "Open the door." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by suspicion. What if this was a trap? What if the king had been captured, forced to call out under threat? "How many men attacked us in the clearing?" Thomas called back, keeping his voice low. A pause. "3," came the reply. "I killed one. The others fled when they realized I wasn't as easy a target as they expected." A note of grim satisfaction colored the words. "Now open this damn door before they return with reinforcements." Thomas removed the bar and pulled the door open just enough for the king to slip through, then quickly resealed it. The monarch looked like he'd battled the forest itself. Clothing torn, face scratched by branches, a fresh cut across his right cheekbone seeping blood. But he stood straight, sword still in hand, eyes alert despite exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "You found it," he said, glancing around the lodge with visible relief. "Good. We're safe here, at least until dawn." He moved to the fire, holding his hands out to the flames. "No sign of pursuit?" "One man, patrolling the pines," Thomas reported. "I managed to distract him and slip past." He set the poker aside. "They said something strange, that you were worthless to them without me." "Why would they care about a miller's son?" The king sank into one of the chairs, finally allowing his royal posture to slacken. He looked suddenly older, the firelight deepening every line in his face. "Because you're the only living witness to what Captain Roland told you. The only person who can legitimize, or discredit, the claim that my son chose his fate." Understanding dawned on Thomas like ice water down his spine. "Lord Aldrich doesn't want that truth known." "Precisely." The king's hand tightened around his sword hilt. "For 5 years he has shaped the narrative of my son's disappearance. A tragic loss, a grieving father, a kingdom in need of stability. He has positioned himself as the voice of continuity, the natural successor to a throne with no heir." His eyes reflected the dancing flames, hard as stone. "Your appearance with the sword threatens everything he's built." "And the attack today?" "A desperate gamble," the king replied, wincing slightly as he shifted in the chair. "If we both died in a bandit attack while investigating your claims, the sword could be dismissed as a clever forgery. Your story is peasant fantasy. The truth would die with us." Thomas sank onto a bench opposite the king, the enormity of their situation settling over him like a physical weight. "What happens now?" "Now," the king said with grim determination, "we rest. At first light we make for Castle Everton, my cousin's stronghold. It's 3 days' journey on foot. But Lord Halsey remains loyal, and his forces are substantial enough to give even Aldrich pause." Thomas nodded slowly, questions still churning in his mind. "And after that? If we survive to reach Lord Halsey?" The king was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it might contain answers to questions he'd avoided for 5 years. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new quality, not quite vulnerability, but a humanity Thomas hadn't fully witnessed before. "If my son truly chose to disappear," he said quietly, "if he rejected his birthright of his own free will, then I must decide whether to honor that choice or continue searching for a man who doesn't wish to be found. His eyes met Thomas's across the small space between them. "What would you do, Miller's son, if it were your child?" Thomas felt the weight of the question, a king asking a peasant for counsel on matters beyond imagination. Yet in this moment, stripped of ceremony and surrounded by danger, perhaps only a simple man could offer the simple truth this father needed. "I would want to know he was safe," Thomas said slowly, "that he was well, that his choice brought him the happiness he sought." He hesitated, then added, "And I would hope that someday, when he was ready, he might find his way home. Not to his crown, perhaps, but to his father." The king's expression remained unreadable in the flickering firelight. Outside, the wind had risen, whispering through pine branches like distant voices. Within the lodge's stone walls, two men from worlds that never should have intersected sat in unlikely companionship, united by a sword, a secret, and the uncertain promise of dawn. Sometimes the most profound truths come from unexpected sources. A miller's son teaching a king about the true meaning of legacy, a servant woman risking everything to honor a young prince's choice, a royal sword becoming not a symbol of power, but of freedom. This story reminds us that crowns and thrones are merely objects, while the courage to choose our own path is the true inheritance worth passing on. What would you choose if faced with the conflict between duty and happiness? Would you have the strength to abandon a predetermined destiny to forge your own, or the wisdom to understand why someone else might make that choice? Perhaps the greatest act of love isn't holding tight to those we care for, but having the courage to let them find their own way, even when that path leads away from us. If this story touched your heart, remember that sharing it helps others discover the powerful message within these words. Follow our channel for more tales that challenge, inspire, and remind us what it truly means to be human. Like and share if you believe that sometimes the most royal thing we can do is honor each other's freedom to choose.